The room didn't expect it to go there. What began as a routine political discussion slowly tilted into something heavier, something sharper, something that made even longtime listeners lean closer to their screens. Because when Joe Rogan shifted the conversation from Karoline Leavitt's treatment in the media to the broader handling of the Epstein documents, the tone in the studio changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. It started with Leavitt. Her name had been circulating for days after a televised exchange in which critics dismissed her arguments as partisan performance rather than substantive policy positions. And Rogan, who has often emphasized the importance of engaging with ideas rather than caricatures, seemed visibly irritated by what he described as a pattern of reflexive dismissal toward younger political voices, particularly when they don't align with dominant media narratives. He wasn't defending her policies. He made that clear. He was defending the principle that arguments deserve counter-arguments, not shorthand labels. "If you think she's wrong," he said, leaning forward with that measured intensity that precedes his more forceful commentary, "explain why she's wrong. Don't just reduce her to a meme." That line alone would have sparked conversation. But Rogan didn't stop there. He pivoted. And the pivot is what shocked the audience. Because instead of staying in the familiar terrain of media bias and partisan critique, he tied the conversation to something far more volatile: the recurring resurfacing of the Epstein files and the way proximity is handled in public discourse. He didn't accuse anyone of crimes. He didn't name specific journalists, executives, or public figures as guilty. Instead, he asked something that made the air in the room feel denser. Why is it, he asked, that when certain names show up in documents, we're told to calm down, but when others show up in different contexts, the coverage never stops? It was not an allegation. It was a question about emphasis. But in today's environment, emphasis is everything. Rogan clarified immediately that being mentioned in a deposition, contact book, or flight log does not equal criminal conduct. He stressed that charges and convictions are the legal benchmarks that matter. He warned listeners not to conflate social proximity with participation in crimes. Yet he argued that the public reaction to the Epstein documents is not just about guilt, it's about perceived asymmetry. He suggested that when media figures aggressively scrutinize politicians or entertainers, but appear cautious or defensive when their own professional ecosystems intersect with controversial figures, it creates distrust, not proof, distrust, and distrust spreads faster than clarification. The audience, accustomed to Rogan's wide-ranging conversations, seemed caught between agreement and discomfort. Some nodded along in the live chat, others pushed back immediately. But the tension in his voice signaled that this wasn't casual speculation. It was frustration with what he perceives as uneven standards. He returned to Leavitt's treatment as an example. "When someone young and outspoken gets dismissed outright," he said, "people see that and think, okay, so you won't debate her. Why?" Then he expanded the lens. "And when powerful institutions avoid detailed discussion about their own proximity to controversial figures, people think the same thing." Again, he did not allege crimes. He did not claim hidden evidence. He repeated, almost deliberately, that proximity is not guilt. But he argued that explanation matters, transparency matters, tone matters. What made the moment shocking wasn't a dramatic outburst, but the way Rogan layered two seemingly separate issues: media dismissal of political figures and cautious framing of Epstein-related overlap, into a single theme: credibility. He described how credibility erodes not from proven wrongdoing, but from perceived double standards. He acknowledged that news organizations operate under legal constraints, that defamation law demands precision, that repeating names without context can cause harm. He agreed that responsible reporting requires caution, but he questioned whether caution sometimes slides into distance. "If you don't explain," he said, "people fill in the blanks." The guest across from him pushed back, arguing that explainers have been published, that court documents are public, that the legal system has processed the case through established channels. Rogan conceded those points, yet maintained that public trust is not restored by quiet publication alone. It requires visible engagement. He described how the phrase Epstein files has become shorthand for something much larger than a set of legal documents. It symbolizes elite access. It symbolizes institutional blind spots. It symbolizes a perception that power insulates. And when that symbol intersects with media institutions, audiences become hyper-attentive. Rogan made clear that assuming guilt without evidence is reckless. He criticized online lists that circulate without context. He condemned social media's tendency to equate mention with misconduct, but he also criticized what he called tone policing curiosity, arguing that dismissing public questions as conspiracy thinking can deepen suspicion rather than reduce it. The conversation grew more intense, though still controlled. Rogan spoke in long, deliberate sentences, emphasizing that skepticism must remain tethered to evidence, yet institutions must recognize that trust cannot be demanded, it must be earned. He framed his defense of Leavitt not as partisan loyalty, but as consistency. If young political figures deserve to have their arguments debated rather than caricatured, then media institutions deserve to have their proximity explained rather than ignored. The shock wasn't that he defended someone controversial. It was that he did so while simultaneously warning against reckless accusation in another high-voltage arena. The dual message unsettled listeners. It resisted easy categorization. He was not attacking the legal outcomes of the Epstein case. He was not denying documented crimes. He was interrogating how narratives are shaped around proximity. As clips began circulating online, the most provocative lines were isolated from the repeated disclaimers. Headlines framed it as Rogan questioning Epstein connections. Critics argued that even raising institutional overlap risks fueling suspicion. Supporters argued that refusing to discuss overlap fuels it more. The firestorm followed a familiar arc. Opinion threads multiplied. Commentators dissected his tone. Some accused him of blurring lines between inquiry and insinuation. Others praised him for articulating public frustration with media asymmetry. Through it all, Rogan returned to the same anchor points. Evidence matters, charges matter, conviction matters, speculation without proof harms innocent people. Yet he refused to retract his core challenge. Consistency, he said near the end of the episode, is the only way credibility survives. That line lingered longer than any accusation could have. Because in a media landscape fractured by competing narratives, credibility is the currency everyone claims and few fully command. The audience reaction reflected that fracture. Some listeners felt he had courageously addressed uncomfortable questions without crossing into defamation. Others felt he had walked too close to insinuation. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: the conversation was uncomfortable. And discomfort, in a long-form format, often signals that something deeper is being examined. By the time the episode ended, the shock wasn't rooted in explosive revelation. It was rooted in the refusal to simplify. Rogan had defended a political figure's right to substantive debate while also insisting that public institutions address proximity transparently. He had cautioned against online mob verdicts while criticizing perceived media silence. He had resisted both complacency and conspiracy. And in doing so, he ignited a reaction that said more about the current state of trust than about any single name in any single document. Because when trust erodes, even careful questions sound incendiary. And when public discourse becomes polarized enough, defending due process and demanding transparency at the same time can feel like walking a tightrope above a cultural fault line. That's what shocked the audience. Not a new allegation, not a secret list, but the recognition that in today's environment, consistency is rarer and more destabilizing than outrage.